So now for my introduction of our keynote speaker today. You will find his bio, his complete bio, in your packet. I'll give a very brief description of some of the highlights. You can read the details, the many details of his experience and expertise in your packet. But Dr. Danny Davidson, president of the American Councils for International Education, has focused much of his professional life on the development, oversight, and support of international initiatives in educational development, training, and research, primarily through the work of the American Councils and its partner organizations in the U.S., Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East and Asia. In its 4 decades, American Councils has developed into one of the premier American educational and international training organizations, designing and implementing large-scale U.S. and foreign government-funded exchange and fellowship programs, as well as major initiatives in research, development, and innovation funded by private foundations and donor groups. Now, what really brings him here today is that he currently serves on the Commission on Language Learning through the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In response to a bipartisan request from members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, the Academy created a national commission to examine the current state of language education, project what the nation's education needs will be in the future, and offer recommendations for ways to meet those needs. The Commission on Language Learning is composed of national leaders in education, scientific and humanistic research, business, and government. Their primary task is to suggest a range of options for improving and making more widely available a set of educational approaches, services, and technological innovations. The Commission is working with scholarly and professional organizations to gather available research about the benefits of language instruction at every educational level, and has as its objective to initiate a nationwide conversation about the need for greater investment in languages and international education. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Davidson.
Is that computer portable at all? Can you move it as far as the podium or move it? I can't. Oh, do you okay. Want to take it? No, not a problem. No, they're certainly not worth it. Right. Thank you. Colleagues and Provost Palm, Dr. Wood, Bill, thank you so much for the invitation. It's fun, maybe even a little bit of an indulgence, I'm afraid, to be able to talk and work with a group like this, because we're all in the same field and very much faced with the same challenges. I want to echo Provost Palm by saying my very first teaching experience was at Cambridge High in Latin. I was a German substitute teacher, substitute for German at that point, and I spent most of my career in the field of Russian, as some of you know, but that sort of, for me, was a very meaningful kind of turning point in understanding my relationship to the field and why we do this. Today's presentation is focused on a set of themes that are indeed dominant in the discussions held so far by the American Academy Commission on Language Learning. They also, because of the way I've selected them, reflect areas of research interest of my own and of colleagues at American Councils and at Bryn Mawr, where I've been on the faculty for a very long time, several decades. As usual, I would like to use the opportunity to share both some current research findings that relate the study of language to the development of intercultural development of an individual, to some extent to the strong development of critical thinking skills, which I think are very, very closely related to intercultural development. And so I'm going to try to show you a little bit about how that research has gone on, what some of the testing instruments are that have been used, and the way in which present investments in our field are beginning to tell us something about this whole process. I'll go on and on here for, I hope, not too long, maybe 25 minutes or 20 or so. I invite you to interrupt immediately if something is not clear, and I guess we can sort of see the slides. And then I look forward to a lively discussion afterwards. Some of the comments I'll make are intended deliberately to problematize some of the things that maybe we take for granted in the field. We're so used to saying them that we sometimes forget why. In other cases, I hope that the research findings will only back up and support what you already know as experienced practitioners. Very often the best purpose research can provide is to essentially confirm the intuitions and the best practices of what teachers have known all along, right? It's nice to see the empirical backup of something that you know is true. So I hope if some of the things I show you now have that function, that's great. And Bill, everybody can keep the slide sets and do what they are. There are several publications that where this is also cited. So let's get started. Bill already said something about the American Councils. We formed as a consortium of colleges, schools, and universities at MIT in 1974 with the express purpose of providing access for our students, scholars, researchers to parts of the world that were difficult to get either into or out of. In those days, it was closed societies like the Soviet Union, East Europe, and so forth. In the meantime, you see our outreach is to countries, 80 plus today, where Americans go to study, to do research, do field work, or teach, and where people come to the U.S. We're 85% federally funded, so the participation in these programs is not on the basis of how much you can pay, but rather whether you can present the merit credentials to get accepted to the programs. And some of them I'm sure you have heard of. The English-speaking world is sort of notably missing here, as you'll see. None of my locations around the world are what you would call a sort of famous vacation spots, but they're important critical regions of the world: Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Near East, South Asia, all of Eurasia, China, and so forth. Okay. First point I just wanted to make is already well known to everyone in this room, but just that the concept of international education has continued to change a lot over these fields, over these years. In my generation, international education was rather an elite enterprise. People who went to study overseas, who pursued international learning time on other university campuses around the world, typically fell into two groups. Either they were quite wealthy and did this at their own expense, and or they were training as analysts. We didn't have a lot in between. That has totally changed in the meantime, and it's been a kind of position of the U.S. government and Department of Education that all good education, well-rounded education, is by definition international. It's by definition global. And so the issue of preparing people for the global challenges is one of the things that we work on. America in the world in America. In other words, we've got as much diversity in our own domestic populations, in our institutions, in our organizations. Walk through a hospital. I don't know if you saw the recent data from the 2011 census, but the number of heritage learners in the New York City public school system as of 2012 is, do you know? 43.5%. That is a very substantial. We have, according to the most recent census, 20.3 percentage of all American families today, according to the census, speak a language at home other than English. So we have a changing demographic. The distribution of our heritage learners and first-generation populations is not symmetrical, as you've seen. So you take New York, LA, Atlanta, you take the big urban centers, and you have a picture that's actually richer. And that's why programs of dual language immersion and so forth, I'm going to talk a bit about immersion, are so very, very important, because they're capitalizing on that bilingual strength, or that incipient bilingual strength that kids and families bring, and they understand that language that they speak at home is something they also can benefit immensely from if they stay with it, and that their fellow students who are Anglo-based can learn a lot as well in that process. Now, this is something I think everybody in this room knows. The language teachers could do this lecture at this point, but if you're from the business world or the journalism or government, you just might want to pay attention to that sort of measurement artifact, which is widely accepted across language language specialists, both in government, in business, and academia. And that is a functional model, a proficiency-based model, not a linear scale, say, of 1 to 800 or something, but a model that attempts to capture the full cultural, communicative, socio-pragmatic skill set that an educated native speaker would bring to a conversation. That 5 is the educated native speaker in theory. And we train people in this country from 0, the bottom of the pyramid, upward through that scale, and we rank students. You heard about the seal of biliteracy. It involves an actual ranking of the person along that rate, along that scale. A 0 is a novice, is a person with a certain kind of repertoire of memorized phrases. A 1 is a young learner, a kind of still novice learner of the language who can communicate on the level of a sentence. They actually create on the level of the sentence, but you would never ever mistake them for native. And a lot of what they say is not fully comprehensible, but they can communicate in a very basic way. A 2 has operational fluency. A 2 can actually survive in the overseas culture, again, haltingly, occasionally with misunderstandings, but get along with people, even those who don't speak routinely with foreigners. And then there's 3. And 3 is a level set by the U.S. government for professional language designated positions of significance around the world, let's say in an embassy or in a government agency, where a person must bring to the table that professional level skill. It's the same level of skill that we would want in hiring a specialist to work in our university or work in a business, to represent a company overseas. You can imagine that 3-level threshold is, in a sense, where it's at. That's really what we're trying to train for. 3s can do a lot with the language. And then there is another one there, the 4. We used to say 4s are not trained, they're born, but now we're training them. And 4s are people with very, very near native, almost balanced bilingual control of the language. There may be some 4s in this room. I suspect there are people who almost effortlessly shift from one language to the other. So all of these are kind of relevant things. The reason I'm stopping on this for a moment is just to make sure that you understand the numbers, because the results I'm going to show you reflect kind of what we're getting right now in the U.S. along these lines. Now, what we need in this country, and this is a wonderful chart brought together for the Languages for All seminar a couple of years ago by Richard Brecht, shows we need a population, in a sense, that also draws from all those levels of proficiency, a base of that pyramid of people who are at least globally aware, right, who have had exposure to learning the language and understand in some ways what it means to work in other parts of the world, to enjoy the perspectives of different cultures and languages. And we need a lot of people like that, more than we now have. We need another group of people who have the basic intermediate skills, able to use occupationally and for personal reasons a language. Those are people that can cross borders relatively easily. You wouldn't hang heavy responsibilities. That's not the one you want negotiating your contract for you or running your office, but they can certainly do something. And Dr. Brecht and the Languages for All seminar came to the conclusion that really the whole U.S. population should reflect these levels. We should be able to place all our citizens somewhere on that scale. You need a core of people who are global professionals. And finally, you need at the top of the pyramid a small group of people who are the true experts who can train the next group and train the teachers and study the regions on that expert level. At a Senate hearing in 2012, convened by then Senator Akaka from Hawaii, on the federal workforce, the issue of these language-designated positions in government came up. This is sort of an interesting story, and I had the honor of being one of those who testified at that hearing. Senator Akaka was very astute on this issue of language deficit, particularly in the way that it affects the ability of our own government to function effectively in the world, whether it's in commerce or trade or regulatory or nuclear arms or military or whatever else, diplomacy. Called to testify under oath the HR directors of 4 major U.S. government agencies. Think for a moment now who you have in the room at that point. The head of human resources of the State Department, Department of Defense, I think FBI was one, and Homeland Security was another. And the State Department HR director responded when he said, okay, you've got these, see that global professional level, those threes. How many of the global professional positions, the senator asked, in the State Department, those language designated slots, are filled by people with the requisite skills? And there was a pause, and then the HR director said, Mr. Chairman, the number, we face a difficult problem in the State Department of filling those positions with those with the requisite skill, or filling them with people with less than the requisite skills, or not filling them at all. And so the senator pushed then what percentage is actually filled, and the answer was 24%. The Defense Department counterpart then testified that their number, while growing is better, was in the mid-teens, 13%. And then I guess the high point of that whole conversation, Bill Rivers was sitting in the hall at the time, was Homeland Security, you would think, would know. Homeland Security HR director said, Mr. Chairman, we have no idea how many of the language designated people are actually there. Now that, I've got to tell you, did not instill a great deal of confidence, because in some ways our government is very, at least sensitive to these issues. They understand the need for global professionals. They understand the need for language designated positions. If you're in the military, it's very important you understand what that guy just said to you, right? Because that your life may hinge on the next thing that happens. So that ability to understand language and words is in fact mission critical in many, many government agencies, just as it is for the social sector and just as it is for U.S. business. So that little concern about national capacity is one of the reasons that the U.S. Department of Education does what it does. It's trying very hard to keep this investment strong and make sure that we're all still thinking and brooding about this and not feeling complacent. Okay, now the training programs that we administer overseas, I'm going to show you a little bit about what types of interventions are undertaken with the idea of taking Americans at different levels of proficiency, however they come out of this K-12 system, the undergraduate system, or at the BA level. One of the jobs I have is to design programs, overseas immersion programs, that will take those students to the next level. The underlying myth here, and it's one I'm sure every one of you has bumped up against, it's a vicious myth, really. That is that, frankly, Americans aren't very good at foreign languages. I'm talking about people out there in general. I can't tell you how many times one encounters individuals who will say, yeah, I studied German once. Then I went to Germany, and you know, nobody really could make much sense of my German. Or how many, you've heard individuals saying, or I studied 2 years of French in high school, I didn't get very much. Or worse yet, people say, I guess I'm just not very good at it. But that is a pervasive myth, not among you all, but among others out there, many of whom are actually the policymakers and the decision makers in our educational networks, people whose own experience was dismal, right, or less, and now they're in charge. And they may be in charge of corporate recruitment, or they may be sitting in a government office, they may be sitting in a school board somewhere, but there are a lot of people with dreary experiences that happened before. And so one of the first things we want to shatter with the Academy report is get off that, right? Americans are quite good at this. It's not just the Europeans that speak so damn well, right? Our students, and not just the heritage kids that have a chance, but all Americans, if they have a halfway decent course of study and support, they will come out as good as the best in any country. And so the immersion is part of that. If you live in Europe, immersion is easy to come by. If you're in North America, there's still increasing possibilities for immersion, including dual language, as well as overseas study. I'm going to show you some of the overseas data, and I hope you find this encouraging, because this is designed to lay to rest myth number one. These are high school students. This is a single year sample. I have multiple years and longitudinal stuff going back for many years, but I wanted to show you a single sample of Arabic. These are American students of Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian. Tough languages, by most standards. And the blue bars to the left of that chart show the entering proficiencies. This is the level of proficiency using the ACTFL scale, a version of that pyramid I showed you. Notice most of them entered with kind of high novice proficiency. Novice high is what you see. Some of them entered with no proficiency at all, just rank beginners. And these are gap year students who come to us with a variety of backgrounds and who spent a year in Morocco, in Kazan, or in Nanjing. And I want you to see what the impact of that year of study is. You see that the entering proficiency and the exit proficiency is stunningly different. For those who love statistics there in this room, you're looking at 3 standard deviations difference between the entering proficiency and the exiting proficiency. Students who lived in a home, they had training, they attended classes, they had cultural programs, they lived with families, right, as well as going to local schools and taking the language. And they are entering college with 2-level proficiency, with advanced. I don't know about GSU. I can tell you at Bryn Mawr, these students come into my Russian 380 class. That's an upper class course ready for people at the juniors and seniors for the most part. Tremendous amount of language, and they're kicking it off as entering freshmen with advanced proficiency. Now that's a story, that's good. And what they can then go on to do in their 4 years of college is revolutionary. Among other things, they uproot some of our weaker departments and make them actually get on the ball and work hard and teach in the target language and offer strong subject. They don't necessarily major in the language, right? They don't have to major. With that amount of language on entrance, they can major in anything they want. We just want to keep the language in tow and part of this, okay? That's the first thing I wanted to show you. Now, here's another program that perhaps you've heard of called the Critical Languages Summer, the CLS State Department program. It's a post-9/11 addition to the portfolio of federally funded programs. It is richly representative of American diversity. We recruit from community colleges, from primarily Hispanic organizations, from tribal schools, as well as from state colleges, universities, and liberal arts institutions. Wonderfully broad. You're looking at a single year's program, entering proficiencies of these sort of typical sophomores and juniors. They enter the program, about 1/3 of them with no prior language, and about 2/3 of them with intermediate level proficiency. Bill and others in this room knows that intermediate level proficiency in a critical language is pretty much the norm around the United States right now. If you start your language in college, that's about how far we're going to get you using the standard kind of courses that are there. And you see the effect even of an intensive 8-week summer. Again, they're not bumming around, let me stress. They are living with families, they're going to class, they're doing content-based work as well as language work. But even in the summer, you can see the incremental impact of that intensive immersion program. And finally, I'll show the flagship. This is sort of indeed the flagship program that is sponsored by the Department of Defense, another piece of the National Security Language Initiative. And there you can see the entering proficiency of these students is 2 on average in the advanced range. And please take a note at the graduating levels. They're superior, right? They're all coming out 3. And that tall column that says 79% there is actually an aggregate. I could tell you that 27% of that 79% are actually at level 4, not surprisingly. If you've got that many people at 3, a certain number are actually 3+, and still another one is 4. So I want us to lay to rest, if we could agree right now, the myth that Americans aren't good. Those kids are just graduating BAs, and they're coming out sometimes having started the language in college, sometimes having begun in school, ideally, and they're coming out majors, non-majors from all over the country as 3s, right? So we need to agree, or higher, right? And that's across all those mean languages I was telling you about. Okay, so myth number 1. Next, it's not enough to have language proficiency. And what on earth does it even mean to have language proficiency at level 3 and above? We want to talk a little bit about cultural intelligence, a new phrase perhaps. It's sometimes called soft skills. I like this one better. It's not my term, but let's talk a little bit about what else this tells us. Language is just part of the picture, isn't it? The 21st century intercultural competencies need best to be seen as mixed, a combination of attitudes, of knowledge, of skills, all of which contribute to a mindset that is open to different forms of learning, to multiple perspectives, to multiple lenses. I wanted to dwell on this just a little bit because studying a language alone doesn't quite get you here, but this is part of it. Learning a language and learning to use a language effectively does get you here. How do we nurture an attitude of respect, an openness, a curiosity, right? A willingness to move beyond one's comfort zone, especially if you're 20 years old. Think about that comfort zone and what that means. Readiness to demonstrate that others are valued. How do we move ourselves beyond the kind of typical ethnocentrism that we find in all parts of the world, right, without training? Presumably moving beyond ethnocentrism is why we go to the university, why we go to school, why we get an education, is to broaden our horizon, not narrow it. But do we? To what extent does this happen? I'll show you some stats in a moment. Knowledge is clearly part of it. Knowledge of culture-specific knowledge, understanding worldviews. If you're in the Arab world, you better have a good sense of what Islam means in that part of the world and the different Islams. You better understand something about women's role in that culture. Skill sets have to do with interactional skills, but also abilities to observe, to listen, to evaluate, to analyze, to interpret, and so forth. That's easier said than done. It's what any good education is supposed to do. But are we doing it in language education? We may be positioned in language education to do this as well or better than anyone, because we've got a deck stacked here that puts students in the position where they have to do this in order to succeed. These are issues of behavior and communication, and I wanted to point out some of the policy frameworks which our Academy Commission looks at as try to understand what does the new policy framework for the United States look like in this area. Notice that comparing the Common European Framework, UNESCO, the foreign language standards of the United States, the UK, New Zealand, and China, notice the emphasis on social and linguistic knowledge to participate in multilingual communities. We call it the community standard in language and our own. Notice it's not just about jabbering, about communicating, or about getting your own feelings out there. It's also about interaction, about ability to resolve conflicts, to mediate between cultural groups, to communicate effectively. Right now, for the Europeans, the discussion of intercultural skills is highly centered around social integration. The same discussion here in Atlanta and in the United States is actually not centered on that so much as it is employability, right? It's about contributing to the economy. A lot depends on where you are. They're both important, right? The immigration crisis in Europe has kind of boosted the social integration agenda in a powerful way. Now, I found this pretty interesting. So getting to the business world and who it is we're training. Harvard does these studies all the time. This particular study was looking at what are the characteristics of, were there any common characteristics was really the question, among 1,300 recognized business innovators from the US and Europe. Recognized talents, you can name a dozen of them yourself. Any kind of common personality traits, because if so, can we train those? And the initial finding of the Harvard study was no, there are no common traits, until they noticed the following. Something that was termed contextual intelligence was that ability, the widespread ability to identify trends, shared ability to recognize context, shift context, and synthesize across contexts. The difference between successful executives and less successful executives. People in this room are smiling. You know where this is going, don't you? What's cool about this is that our field had nothing to do with it, right? Bless our hearts. We didn't occur to us to do this. Leave it to Harvard Business School, who brought you learning styles 20 years ago through management styles, and then it made its way into our language classrooms. Well, they're doing it again with their concept of cultural intelligence, if you will. Contextual intelligence. Contextual acuity the self-referential ability to recognize one's own personal, cultural, and organizational context. That thing called cultural self-awareness, of understanding what are the limitations of the pair of lenses that I typically look at everything with, right? What is it that I don't see through my glasses, right? If I could change glasses, or if I could replace them with trifocals or something, what else would I start seeing that I currently miss? Right? That's a challenge to students, a challenge to some of our faculty as well. But that awareness of who you are. In the language field, many of you know that when you ask a learner of a language, how good are you? It's a good example of self-awareness. How good are you with this language? I can almost tell you the level of the student by the way they answer that question, right? Because at level 3, the self-awareness, the awareness of one's own actual speaking proficiency is almost exactly in line with the measured level of proficiency. At level 2, it tends to be about almost a half a level off, and at level 1, it may be as much as one whole proficiency range off. Zeros and ones typically describe themselves as advanced, right? Advanced will typically describe themselves as superior until you test them, right? Superiors define themselves as superior. They know exactly what they can do. The executive function is so attuned with their absolute abilities that they know the language situations and cultural situations. I can enter this, I can do this, I shouldn't be doing this. This is over my head. This is a highly sensitive area. I'm gonna work around it. That's the difference between the 3. It's probably the same thing here in terms of cultural self-awareness. My sense is that students rate themselves grossly higher in terms of intercultural development than they are when their level of development is low. And as it comes into alignment, they'll actually converge at a level of sort of rather astute cultural development. I'll just show you a picture of it if you'd like. So it's not a matter, and this was sort of an example, that article, and there's the reference at Harvard Business Review in 2014 called Contextual Intelligence. This study, this particular study, was focused on business failure, what HBS does all the time. Why did that product fail, right? Give me the case study on this. What can we do to change that? What interventions? In this case, the subject was why and how do we account for the high percentage of transnational, international business failures mounted by the United States. And that's where the contextual intelligence came from. Those that succeeded manifested in their planning and their strategy a high level of contextual intelligence. Those who didn't. Typical mistake made by American business in trying to move successful enterprises overseas, overestimation of technology. Myth number 2. Technology basically is going to solve all this, right? In another couple of years, we really won't even need language teaching anymore, right? Because you're going to have machines that just do it, right? Myth number 2, we need to lay to rest, okay? And that may be another subject conversation. Nothing could be further to the truth. Yeah, it's fine so long as all you're doing is transferring kind of discrete denotative information. Yeah, the machines may indeed be faster. If you love Google Translate, hang in there, right? It's great. But so long, the moment it gets sensitive, the moment it becomes culturally embedded, the moment it becomes metaphorical, the moment things start really mattering, once it's high stakes, you better be careful with the machine, right, at that point. Here, it was a different type of trust, boundless American trust in technology. And the case study that's here, I didn't put that case study up, is of all things, that of a new technology for the production of cement. That's romantic, isn't it? A new technology for production of cement. And the thought went something like this. Now, it's not hardly a place in the world that doesn't need cement, right? And it's locally produced. So here's a company with a new technology for the production of cement and the things that go with it. And it worked amazingly well in North America. And then we moved it over the border to Canada. And guess what? It worked there, too. And so that means we're ready to go global, right? And then they went to Mexico. And then they tried to go to Eastern Europe, and then they tried to go to South Asia, and with each successive attempt, this sort of wonderful technology, for some reason, kept failing. And it wasn't because the technology wasn't good. It's just that local context was so profoundly different, whether it's supply chain, the network of relationships, who knows who, the regulatory environments, the culture of each of those places in terms of who buys from whom and who hires whom. You can get the picture very quickly. That accounted for the remarkable high level of failure, even of sort of straightforward technology exports that should have probably worked. At least common sense suggested they would have. That's what that study is. And it's one of the reasons we're here today. It's one of the reasons why everyone in this room who teaches language is very important. Now, let's go back to the government for just a minute and see if we can see an explicit articulation of what these behaviors, these intercultural competencies look like at level 3. I think this is really a cool list. This is ILR regulates the sort of government standards for all federal agencies that test for language use. So there's language proficiency, and then there's intercultural competence. And notice how they align. It's sort of interesting. Everybody in this room probably knows the level 3 standard, but you may not know this. Look at what is required. Able to participate successfully in most social and practical professional interactions, indicating that these may require a range of formal and informal language and behavior. Let me walk over here and just point to a couple of things that are, I think, really stand out. Controls nonverbal responses, right. Makes sense. Can understand and make appropriate use of cultural references and expressions. Can sense an area that is sensitive. Can sense a taboo area and can move around it. A level 1 doesn't sense a taboo area. They plow straight through it, right? As though it weren't there. A level 2 will sense it, that they have enough understanding of language and culture to say, I've just ventured into some really sensitive territory. I'm just not quite sure how I'm going to back out of this, right? A level 3, by contrast, can address it, can deal with it, can go in, through, around, and circumlocute in a way that's acceptable to a native speaker. That's a lot of language. That's not just linguistic knowledge, right? That's understanding of how the world works and how people interact. That's level 3, intercultural competence. And social media and so forth. You can read it. I won't read it all, but I just want to point out some of the hallmarks of level 3 competence. Now, intercultural development continuum, the hard stuff here. I'm using Milton Bennett and Michael Hammer's IDI test. Does anyone here use the IDI in your work? Because it's widely used in industry, and particularly in mixed industrial settings like hospitals, like multinational settings where the clients are multinational, law enforcement, where a manager needs to be assigned to a workforce that is diverse. And they need to find ways of people. How do you identify the people that will interact most effectively with those diverse workforces? In this study, I've tried to relate intercultural development with language proficiency with the things I just showed you. But notice the scale as it looks. This is the kind of IDC equivalent of that inverted pyramid we looked at a moment ago, from lowest level of skill to the highest level of intercultural sophistication. Notice it begins with denial. Not there, whatever it is, I don't see it. And even if I do see it, it's not good. Denial develops to polarization. Some of you may have encountered this sometimes from a person who comes from another culture. It happens, say, with foreign students coming to the United States. I'll give you an example of students who had studied English in Hong Kong and came to the U.S. and said, my Lord, everyone speaks English here. You know, this is really cool. Everything about this place is right. Everything is perfect, right? Everything at home, bad stuff, not working, right? This is how things should be. Or the opposite. Everything here is wrong. Nothing works the way it should. I need to go home. So the cultural shock works like that. Often polarization is a typical reaction in kind of on that continuum. Minimization is the first move away from ethnocentrism. A minimizer admits that there's difference, that it may be positive, that it's interesting, but they still take the position that, you know, guys, basically we're all the same. Now you decide how useful that is. Basically, we're all the same. And a minimizer will will sort of move a little bit away from the monocultural, but still dominated by that monocultural mindset. And then you see the next level of acceptance. And those are people that intellectually get where they are. They make good sense. They can explain it. Their emotional reactions to cultural differences, they can control. And then the last stage is adaptation or integration. Those are people who effortlessly move from one culture to another without ever getting confused about what their own identity is. The polarizers are a little bit of a problem. They can't keep their own position straight in all of this. It flips one way and then the other, and they lose track of who they are in the process. The mature forms of intercultural development don't ever do that. People are very clear about their own views, but they can move back and forth. They can change lenses. That's a great skill. The people heading our overseas offices, I need to have from that high level, right? The people that can easily move. Remember, striking a deal with a business partner is much, much easier than maintaining that relationship over many years, right? Signing an agreement is, Lord, you do that over dinner, right? Signing an agreement is great. It's how you handle that first conflict between partners. That's where the mediating and intercultural skills are required, right? It's how you deal with conflict, because every business relationship or every academic relationship or personal relationship, sooner or later is going to bump into a conflicting situation, and that's the test. Can you mediate that, or do you throw up your hands and walk away, right? Well, that depends on what you see in front of you. Can you change lenses effectively to negotiate that difference? The big challenge. Just to show you some results of an ongoing study that is about 1 year old, I did comparative IDI scores against proficiency scores for a group of students, 5 groups of students, 4 of whom had language training at different proficiencies, and 1 that had immersion overseas without any language training at all. And the simple, I know the numbers aren't terribly meaningful, but if you look in that first column the third column called mean post, that's the average post score, you'll see that the first one, the top, had the largest gain in intercultural development. And it kind of goes down. The lower the proficiency, the less the gain, all the way to the YES program at the bottom, equally selective, but it had no language training. It also registered no gain in intercultural development, right? That's a study underway, not published. We'll be doubling that N size this year to understand better the relationship. But it's one thing that sort of is clear, that even at the low end, you'll see significance in terms of cognitive skills at cognitive frame shifting. You see the third line down, cognitive frame shifting. That's significant, right? That shift, even with our lower proficiency, those high school kids I was telling you about, look what they're doing. They're shifting cognitive frames, right? They're recoding behavior in a native-like way, even at lower levels of proficiency. So cool things are happening when it's empowered by language. There it is again. So how does it feel to the low end, that kind of intercultural development at the early stage, at minimizing stage? And this is where almost all our students are. You realize that, right? That's who goes to college in America. They're low minimizers. And some are polarized and some are deniers, right? And almost no one is anything higher than that. That's who we teach. That's our population right now. And so we've got a lot of work here to do between you and me. Language is the key. It's part of it, but it's an enabler. It alone doesn't deliver the development. So look at how those students, those are community college kids from coastal Carolina State. I thought you would just pick some place, right, that's not local. I like those comments, right? That's early stage awareness of cultural difference. I'm more aware of social problems and global issues facing the world. That's great. So glad they come home and say that. I'm better able to see similarities and differences in my own culture and other cultures. Over the next 6 months, I plan to participate or volunteer in a project of some kind. Again, that's early stage. Now here is an interesting experience. This is next stage. This happens to be a heritage speaker who is at level 3. And notice what they say. I tend to play the role of mediator when a fellow student becomes confused, and I'm able to explain what's going on. These are kids overseas in which the 3-level heritage speaker is able to serve as mediator for the non-heritage people in the group. This one is pushing near native. Look at this level of cultural engagement. Learned a lot about Russian history. Understood the culture, the jokes, the aphorisms, the historical references. In the end, no one figured out that I was from the US. And that's the near native experience at the high end of the scale. She's very proud of that. One of the students said to us this actually last week, I took my final OPI test and I felt disappointed because the examiner didn't ask me any hard questions. And this is an aspiring student, you know, where were the hard questions? Wait for that to come, right? And she said, and then it dawned on me, they were all hard questions. It's just for me, they weren't hard, right? I could now deal with them sort of in a normal, I don't want to say effortless, but almost effortless way. We talk about level 3 social pragmatics, and this brings us back to the English classroom, why I think this intercultural development is particularly fostered by advanced level learning. You can see that you can't actually make a request in a foreign language unless you know something about the view of the world and the social organization and the networking of the place where you just made the request. Apologies, I'll give you one funny example from an apology. An American attempting to apologize to a Russian speaks excellent Russian on the level of linguistics, but hasn't quite mastered the Russian view of the world, right? You know, the social pragmatic level. And so an American will say, oh, I'm so sorry I kept you waiting, it's my fault, so on. Very familiar thing. Americans rush in and assume responsibility for whatever just went wrong, even when they had nothing to do with it, right? How many times have you heard Americans say, oh, guys, I'm sorry, it's my fault, right? That was just how we talk, right? Russian, quickly assume responsibility. Most parts of the world do not rush in and assume full responsibility for what just happened, right? Especially when it went wrong. That can be seriously misunderstood by a native speaker who might look at you and say, oh, really? It's your fault. You mean this was all intentional? This was part of your grand plan, was to make me sit here and wait for 20 minutes or to not return the book you promised me, right? So understand, the same apology in Russian would sound like this in English. It just so happened today that the transport system was delayed. And I thought about getting there some other way, but I couldn't. And unfortunately, my cell phone is not working underground. It needs to be as impersonal and external to the agent as possible. But that comes to a Russian view that control, the locus of control in this world, doesn't reside inside you. How do you get an American to accept that? We're so big on self-reliance, right? We so define ourselves, our personality in terms of self-reliance and our independence, and right, we do things, that you have to suddenly get in a whole different view of the world to even normally apologize in another language. See the point I'm making? I can go through all 14 social pragmatic functions and show you how they're different. They'll be different in every culture, right? Depending on how that culture views the world. That's social pragmatic strategy selection, right? I can get the words right, but the strategy selection's got to also be right, or the whole thing fails just the same. And that has to do with one's intercultural development, right? We're almost done. Words. Words match in the dictionary. They rarely match on the level of connotations. It's the associative power of the words that matter. There you can see two words compared by associative power in Russian and in English. The word for success, which notice for an American is strongly associated with financial success, and fame, and for Russian is associated with happiness and joy. Very, very different categories. I wish you success. I just said something very different in Russian. And notice, go down about 5 items there and see luck and goals. And notice for the Russian, the dark blue bar, luck, fate, determinism, much greater in the Russian audience than for the English, right? When I'm successful in American, it's because, guys, I did it. I did it all myself, right? For a lot of cultures, when you're successful, it's because among the many moving things, this sort of fell together in the right way, and I was fortunate, right? I was fortunate. So to summarize, that's cultural intelligence. Coming through language is not something purely cognitive. It is greatly helped by overseas immersion and requires interaction, a real ability to observe and reflect, ability to analyze, and executive control in the process. All these are things that we associate with critical thinking, things we associate essentially with higher order learning in general. Let me stop right there. Thank you, Bill.
We have some time for questions.
Objections? Yeah.
In this table, we talked a lot about technology.
Uh-huh.
So I guess I'm going to be commenting right and ask you
Sure.
a little bit about it. I think that what I got from my group here, that technology isn't really, I mean, it's present now, and we know the limitations. And so I would spin it more not as a limitation, what it can cover, but what it can do. And then in reality also, you mentioned Google Translate, how 3 years ago it was different from Google Translate now.
Yes.
And Siri now and what it's able to do and how it's able to answer my questions and what it can give us.
Yeah.
And so for me, I'm looking at it more as in the connectivistic theory of it's part of my body now. You know, I don't have to go to a classroom to access technology. It's with me. And so I feel like I see it more in a positive sense of I don't see it as a myth. I see it more as a I can harness it, I can use it, and I know it's not perfect, just like your cement analogy, but I think that there's a lot of it that can help me in the future.
Totally true. Totally true. For a generation of Americans that kind of lives 24/7 in a digital universe, right? Their whole lives are there in a way that maybe my generation was not. I love the way you say it. And remember, my reference was like that other myth about saying Americans basically aren't good at this, right? That's stupid, but it's unfortunately widespread. The myth of technology, instead of seeing it as something integrated, as you suggest, is that you don't really need to do anything yourself because the technology you see will just take it all over for you. That's not at all what you meant to say. In fact, we're empowered by that technology, and that's so. No, I totally agree with you. If we can tease that difference out, right? Not that we don't need speakers of languages anymore. That would be exactly the wrong conclusion to bring, right? Thank you. Thank you for that good comment, and I love your correction. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And this is also just a comment. I was really intrigued by the cultural development index, that kind of scale, and I'm just really thinking about the difficulty it poses for us, since the majority of people, even under ideal conditions, are at level 1 or 2. How do we convince those people that people at levels 3, 4, and 5, or where the adaptability have something to offer? Because I think this is actually the model that the humanities and the liberal arts institutions are suffering under so much. We cannot find a way to articulate the value we offer for people who have not already grasped what it is that we offer. And so I guess that's just an observation, but it turns out to be a plea to find ways for us to articulate that in a way that is understandable to people who have not had that, have not gone up that scale, and who have not had the value of a liberal arts education or a second or third language.
Thank you. No, I hope that the American Academy and its own kind of authority in this country can help get that message out on a level that's hard for us just in the education sector or just in the foreign language field to do, because I think we really do understand it. But having data and having actual numbers is also helpful to kind of know at least, well, where are we? If you remember 50 years ago, we couldn't have said very accurately even what levels of proficiency most of our students graduate with. That's not true anymore. But I would say it would be even more helpful if we knew what the level of intercultural development is that we're producing. There's that sort of where it says reflect, not judge. That unfortunately, a 20-year-old, an American 20-year-old, I don't care where they're from, are pretty darn judgmental, actually. And you may have noticed that, right? They're not terribly absorbed by concerns of fairness, right? Necessarily in their own judgments. They may be concerned about social justice. And so it is partly an issue of maturation. The Price study, which I referenced there at Harvard, worked over 30 years trying to essentially describe the same evolution of critical thinking from something he called dualism, which is sort of like polarization, right? Either this or that, everything's right, everything's wrong, to a position of sort of non-committal, unclear plateau of sort of not knowing where anything is, totally disoriented, to finding that idea of what it means to make a commitment to a belief and a commitment to a certain approach. Here you can certainly see that there's a difference between saying, man, that's weird, or God, that's awful, that's disgusting. And I think the power of immersion overseas lies partly in our not quite smoothing out the bumps in every road. Because there's an idea that some of our students want the bumps removed. A group in McNess this past year wanted basically to see the U.S. government and American councils to remove the problem of what they considered sexism among Arab men. Right? Or at least if we couldn't do all Arab men, could we at least please do that among all Arab taxi drivers, right? Because there's that kind of sense that this isn't right and it needs to be fixed now. And so that issue of trying to understand differences in attitudes, some things we don't applaud. I remember a graduate student who spent a summer in Azerbaijan in a village in which women were not allowed to even sit at the same table with men. If you've been in Central Asia, you know what I'm talking about. In fact, they don't. And she was a feminist, more or less, she said, self-proclaimed. And yet, by the end of that summer, her ability to look at that very same social phenomenon, or cultural phenomenon, in a totally different way, saying what it meant to be in the kitchen with the women and the relationship that those women had in terms of freedom, of support, of absolute disclosure, of whatever. There were no secrets, and everybody helped everybody. And she said it was amazing, especially when she came home and didn't have that anymore, and realized that the kinship among the women was like something she'd never experienced anywhere else in the world. Now that's a lens, right? And so sometimes our students evolve in a major way, but that ability to step outside your comfort zone and look at something in a different way is really important. If you can expand your comfort zone that way, it's important. Thank you. Thank you. Other objections? Yes. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, Juliet Stepanyana Abkarian, my fellow Russianist. Thank you, Dr. Davidson. Wonderful talk as always, and your fine work on behalf of us all too. But I'm wondering if you could address briefly the current political climate right now in the U.S. and how you see it as an opportunity as well as a context that poses new kinds of difficulties and biases in working in our respective fields.
Yeah. Thank you. A really good question. I'm sure everyone in this room does think about the current current state of political discourse. We could start there, I guess, and understand that traditional concepts of citizenship are very similar to what we're talking about in terms of how people talk to one another and how we regard difference. I think if it were possible for the U.S. level of intercultural development to increase, and it just has to, Juliet, when you think about it, given that what I said about the census, right? We're now 20.3% non-English speaking families, that a popularity of someone who would say we got to build walls, we got to exclude Muslims, all of that would surely not grow. That would be, I think, harder to be a political winner if you really had the kind of appreciation of diversity and the richness that brings. So I think the challenge is an Anglophone challenge in a way. It's not as bad it's bad in Europe, right, in various ways, but not quite in the same way as it is here. And one of the things that maybe we start with is thinking, myth number 3, Juliet, if you don't mind. Myth number 3. They all speak English anyway, right? We have the Americans aren't good. We have the technology excuse. And don't forget the one that trumps them all. No, right? They all speak English anyway, right? And if English was indeed a tremendous advantage for Americans and Brits and Australians 50 years ago, right, in international trade, English today, if that's all you've got, if that's the only language you have, then English is something that's going to require accommodation wherever you go. Because if you go to China, you go to Europe, you go to Africa, they all speak English and a whole bunch of other languages too. And they're going to, when you walk into the room, everybody's going to have to adjust to you. If you like that idea, if you think that puts you in a strong position, of being the person to whom all the rest of the globe has to accommodate, then go for it. But I think there's probably for Americans, Julia, that's a really hard question in terms of improving generally our political discourse, but also understanding that language can be very empowering in moving us in the right direction. I think that's probably it. And hence to jettison that third of the 3 myths about English being enough. I think if people didn't believe that, it would be harder for them to believe some of the other things. Really important question. Yes. Uh-huh. Oh, introduce yourself too.
Diane Belcher at Georgia State in Applied Linguistics
Thank you.
and
Uh-huh.
ESL. So we have this tremendous resource of a huge immigrant population speaking many different languages.
Yes.
But historically, the trend has been that by the 3rd generation, those immigrants, descendants of immigrants,
Right.
no longer speak the languages
Right.
that their families brought
Right.
with them. Do you see that trend as reversible?
I think it may be reversing already, and I really love that question. Remember what Terry Wiley called the principle of subtractive bilingualism, right? Our philosophy in this country was to assimilate and to subtract that bilingualism, regard it as a deficit, call you an ELL or whatever, and get rid of it as quickly as you can so you're just like everybody else. And that seems truly now to be changing. And one of the ways you see that is, number one, the higher number of first-generation migrants that still have pretty good language at home. And what I believe, as of the most recent data, we have 2,600 dual language immersion programs in the United States. I bet not everybody knew that. It's astonishingly popular. Now, DLI has as many different models as there are programs, I'm afraid. We don't quite have a stable absolute good way of doing it. But DLI is out there in all these communities where you have a population whose language can be the subject of instruction, and that the Anglo learners and the heritage learners both are understood to benefit, not only linguistically, but across all their other disciplines. An American Council's RAND project just came out in January, a 4-year longitudinal study of the Portland City school system, which is a long-standing dual language immersion program, just came out this past year. That study reflects looking at 4th, 8th grade performance on math, science, English, and maybe one other subject, in a study that is one of the rare examples of a randomized treatment. This is actually a serious, rigorous, large N study with randomized selection and matched controls. And that's awfully hard to get in an educational setting, but there where we did. And what we're seeing there is that the heritage learner exits the ELL on average 1 year earlier than the non-DLI kids, and that they're all performing on average about 1 grade level higher in language arts, and in many cases in math and science as well. Very notable cognitive advantages to that dual immersion experience. And so that the word is out about that now, and a lot of, particularly I'd say middle class neighborhoods, are saying we need it now. Whether we're ready or whether we have the training or the students, the teachers or the textbooks, give it to us. It's great, but like any kind of, there's a concern that can be a runaway train if we're not careful. In colleges, in an overseas study, we're seeing increasing numbers of heritage tracks. And I don't know if you do that at your institution or not, either University of Georgia or Emory. But at Columbia, where there's a lot of heritage students, there is a separate track for heritage learners who show up in college without any formal training in their home language, except some, and in fact, some cases, not even the ability to write their name in their home language, but they can absolutely ace a grammatical judgments test. If you give them a multiple choice grammatical judgments test, they'll go and pick the right answer every time. And that's a great exercise, because that gives you kind of a sense of their internalized auditory grammar. And with that kind of internalized grammar, you can then move in a totally different way than we would teach Americans. You go from sound to shape, right? Not the other way, right? Because those kids have internalized, and that's going to happen at UCLA, but there's some really successful examples of, multiple pathways for the heritage learner. Dual immersion is great. Heritage Saturday schools are better than nothing, right? The mosques do an astonishing job. They may be doing a better job in public education and teaching high school Arabic, according to the test scores that we have. They're serious. And finally, then the universities start. We need to make sure that people can do this later in life and not shut the door just because they're 18. I think I gave you much more than you asked me, but was that relevant? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I was struck by the comment about Americans having to accept those accommodations.
Yes.
And I'm worried that they are willing to accept those accommodations, and it just be as part of our American psyche. We're Americans, and we don't really have to learn those languages. I see kids all the time. I'm in charge of a study abroad office, and I see kids all the time going to Europe, and they have these remarkable opportunities and programs. But if language is not involved, I don't know that they develop the way they need to develop. If I had my way, I would make language a component of all study abroad programs.
Yeah.
I can deans would not like that.
The impact, at least on intercultural development, I may have hopped by it there, sorry. The impact, this is the non-language overseas immersion program. Entering proficiency, 95, exiting proficiency, IDI. 95. With a tiny little bit of movement there, whereas the language is there. Now that's very alarming to all of us in this room that do study abroad, because Americans increasingly choose English-speaking countries, right? Why? Oh, because it's easy, right? Secondly, they go for very short amounts of time, right? So the 2-week hop, and so the stuff I showed you today is the other end of the scale. It's going to places that are truly different. Not more expensive, certainly, but truly different. Because to me, that's what Americans have to do, is have that experience of get off that plane and you look around you and say, good Lord, I'm in a different world now, right? This is clearly something, and I think that's what our kids need to have. I think you may agree. Thank you. Yeah.
You had a graphic up earlier that showed a little bit about the preparation involved for these students who anticipate traveling abroad and the things that they're going to have to learn. I'm particularly interested in if there is kind of a very purposeful and planned out cultural knowledge component of what they're going to do. You talk about getting to these advanced levels, level 3, level 4, and these are people who have a very highly developed understanding of cultural nuances of the people who speak these languages. And so I'm wondering, is there a program where you can categorize, is this historical culture, is this social culture, entertainment culture, governmental culture, and taboo and things to avoid? Do you have this program laid out? Do they study, or they just kind of learn this on the go when they're there?
I so wish. Oh, well, just introduce yourself. I happen to know who you are, but just.
I'm sorry, Jamie Patterson, Fulton County Schools. Thank you.
I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? It would be great to have national standards on that, but we're not quite there yet. We had just general guidelines, is I guess what I'd have to say. And depending on the field. Thank you.
So then why, since you brought up flagship, why are the flagship numbers, the growth numbers so low?
Oh, this is for an IBI Jones. That 2 point is pretty good. It depends on this. This is top one. Those are all flagship. All three are flagship. This is a level of flagship. This is the overseas program. I actually broke out that number so you can see. If you take all the flagship students, remember we said them twice. If you take only those that are three, then you get a fairly robust number. Thank you. Thank you for that. Bill, I think we're done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.